Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this. My name is Betsy Key. I'm one of the counselors in the Career Services Office. Doing this today in conjunction with the Public Interest Office to help you prepare your applications for Equal Justice Works. And I will say this, if you are pure public interest, you have no intention of applying to the private sector, you don't have to do the Resumania workshop coming up later this fall. But if you are considering other opportunities, you really should come to both because this is very specific to public interest and there are differences. Starting off, EJW is the biggest public interest career fair. Public sector employers really don't have the budget or human capital to do a lot of widespread on-campus recruitment like law firms do. So this is a wonderful opportunity to reach a lot of different organizations at once. Historically, it was in person. These are actual pictures of the conference and career fair. So this gives you an idea, like this is just a section of the ballroom that they took up. This gives you an idea of the breadth of your competition. And these are people who got interviews. So you really want to stand out in your application material to get those interviews. Historically, it was just a 2L, 3L program. So when it comes to 1Ls, they've only allowed 1Ls to apply for about the past, I think, 2 or 3 years. So not every organization is going to be even entertaining 1L applications. Whether they do or not, if you don't get an interview through this program, you should absolutely reapply in the winter because that's really the big time frame to hire 1Ls anyway. And they will reconsider you. It's just they only have so many interview slots for this program. So moving on, when it comes to your applications, these are the basics that apply to pretty much any application you do. Unless you have a significant pre-law career, your resume really should fit on one page. And if you struggle with that, that's what your counselor is here to help you with. But it's, you're really starting new here, even if you have had a previous career. So I would argue if you had a pre-law career, you probably can still fit it on one page, but there are exceptions and we'll work with you if you are the asterisk. And also cover letters should be brief. They're reading through thousands of applications. So short and sweet is the way to go with those. And a lot of people struggle with cover letters, but we're going to go through a very quick and easy method that you can use and still have a really effective cover letter. These 3 C's, consistent, concise, conservative, that applies to the legal industry in general. Lawyers are very detail-oriented people. So if for Vanderbilt, you say Nashville TN, your undergrad needs to be in the exact same format. It can't spell out the state. And it sounds silly, but that goes to your attention to detail in their mind. So you really want to be very careful with those things. Again, with conciseness, it's because of the volume of applications they look at. And you want to hit them with the highlights of why they should interview you, why they should hire you. And the conservative is not a political conservative. It's very much a conservative in the sense of if you had a marketing background, marketing resumes might be like tangerine font color and boxes of information. They're very artistic and creative and they want to stand out in that way. You don't want to stand out for that in the legal world. They look for content and that's what you want to stand out. So your formatting is actually pretty, you might call it bland or simple, but it's because it's supposed to really highlight your experience and background. Tailored for the recipient, we'll go into a little bit in more detail later, but it really depends on you as to how much you're going to do that. If you're looking at different sectors, private and public, you might have a specific resume for public interest organizations that highlights more of your volunteer work or service work or leadership skills. And then you might have another resume that that basically lists those out very briefly and highlights more of your academic achievements, for example. So that basically just means like consider your audience and think about different things that you might pull out. And even like within organizations, you might highlight things for children's, like a children's department would be different from a resume for a public defender, perhaps. And then of course, like for the case of, for EJW, everything's virtual. You need to submit it in a PDF, not a Word, primarily because you're going to be sending these things to your counselor. They're going to be commenting on things in the document. You don't want that getting out. And it helps control how it looks when it's printed or if people look at it on a phone. And resume paper, you know, to the extent you have in-person meetings with anyone, it should be on true resume paper. You literally just go to Office Depot or the bookstore and look for a box that says resume paper on the side. That's about it for that. Okay, this is probably the most important slide today. This is what makes this program different from Resumania. Public interest organizations are looking for these things. They're very mission driven. They're very much about serving their constituencies, their membership. And that's what you need to keep in mind when you're preparing your application materials. They really like a personal connection to the work because they're mission driven and because with a lot of public interest work, and it can be high stress with a lot of challenges. So they need people that are going to have a little bit of grit and a little bit of personal buy-in into what they're doing, because it goes to the idea that you're going to stick around and you're going to do the job well. So for example, not to say you have to do this, but I had a student one time who was applying to public defenders, and she talked about her family members that had gone through the criminal justice system and how that impacted her and what she wanted to do with her career. That's a very personal example. It doesn't have to necessarily be like that, but you need to make some connection to it beyond just, I want a job for the summer, I want to gain some experience. Now, it might sound weird, but to the extent that you're writing a cover letter to an employer, you want to mention right up front, I have somewhere to live and I'm not worried about funding. Vanderbilt does provide stipend funding that you can apply to, or you can apply for academic credit. So in some way you're getting compensated. Some organizations worry about that if you don't have access to those things, because I think in their minds, they think you might bail on them and you might decide, oh, I need to be paid this summer. I'm sorry, I'm out. And that's what they want to avoid. And I have had, even though like we say every year, you cannot renege once you've accepted a job, every year public interest organizations have their offers reneged because someone's like, I need to get paid, or I don't have somewhere to stay in DC or New York or whatever. So to the extent you know you have these, or you can at least say Vanderbilt has a program I intend to apply for a stipend, it's important to mention that because it could get you an interview over somebody who doesn't explain these things. Language skills I mentioned just because they're really good to highlight, particularly if the organization serves a particular population. There's a really good organization called IUTA. Has anybody heard of it? Okay, well, it's like a domestic violence resource center. I think it's just in the DC area, could be bigger, but they particularly look for people with Spanish skills for obvious reasons. So if you have a foreign language skill and it matches up with the organization, you definitely want to highlight that as well. And these are things that are very important on the public sector side and helpful, but not so important on the firm side. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about with consistent, conservative, and brief, or concise. So this is just your basic roadmap of where we're going here on the resume. And you can see there's not a lot here. There's plenty of white space. White space is good. It gives them room to write notes if they choose to, and it's easy to read. So these are just very basic. And I'm going to whip through this because I don't want to waste a lot of your time on things that you probably can catch really quick. But if you want me to slow down, please raise your hand. Okay, so this is your start. This is a very Vanderbilt specific rule. We do not use the term Juris Doctor, which is pretty common. It's something the faculty came up with and they roll. So you can either do the short form JD or Doctor of Jurisprudence, not Juris Doctor. And that applies to, of course, all resumes. So this is a consistency. Well, this is kind of I think this bothers me more than other people, but I find it redundant to say both and JD anticipated, or JD candidate anticipated May 2025. I usually tell people pick one, and it doesn't matter what you do. You just need to make it clear you're not graduated yet. And then, yeah, so, and this I see a lot too. So we see the short form here. But like somebody might say, candidate for Doctor of Jurisprudence, AB in political science, and that would be incorrect because again, attention to detail. And I know this sounds really silly, but it matters. So yeah, great. This doesn't apply to you this semester, but it certainly will moving forward. Most public sector employers are not really looking for grades. If they do, they request a transcript. So it's not necessary to include them on your resume. They're really more concerned with your drive and desire to be there doing their work than they are your GPA. And it's just a different mindset in hiring. So I mentioned that just to not worry about it once you get grades. Certainly don't need to worry about it today. Your undergraduate GPA, you can list it if you want, you don't have to. Even for private sector, I would say you don't have to unless you just really want to. But if you did your undergrad, you would definitely need to do your law, because then it looks like you're hiding something. Study abroad and thesis or theses are great to highlight as well for any sector, mainly because, especially with public interest, if you're applying to an organization that does global reach work, showing that experience abroad shows your adaptability, your cultural sensitivity, and thesis just goes towards your ability to do a lot of intense, detail-oriented work, thinking on your own, coming up with your own idea. Yes.
This might be a silly question, but what if you had planned to go abroad and
I think it makes for an interesting interview story. So I would probably include it and just put like in parentheses at the end, like canceled due to COVID or pandemic, or something like reformatted domestically due to the pandemic. And it probably will come up in the conversation, and then it could be a good story for resiliency, or how you have just navigated that challenge. And it does show them that you had the intention to gain that experience. So I think that's absolutely valid. Yes.
you don't have one, of course, so how would we format it with your undergrad GPA?
Yeah, that you don't have to worry about it when you don't. And I apologize, it is not super relevant today, but it will be relevant in January. But yeah, for now, don't worry about it. You can include your undergrad and you won't have anything, but these employers, they may not understand exactly when grades come out, but they know you don't have any grades in September, October. So no worries there. Any other questions about the top sections? Okay. Yes.
So the law school education has like honors and activities. Should we list groups that we've like joined but like haven't done anything with yet?
Yes, and the reason for that is it shows intentionality and interest. And yeah, I don't think anyone expects you to like be running the group, but it tells them something about you. And then when you get to the interview, hopefully you've at least gone to a meeting or two and you can speak to what the group does at least. But I think it's worth doing. And yeah, I'm sorry, the sample is probably a 2L because they wouldn't be a Dean Scholar. It's a 1L at this point. Any other questions? Okay, good. All right, so this is the meat of it. If you don't have pre-law experience, you're fine. There's no expectation that you have legal experience. It's great if you do, but it's certainly not required. I think when it comes to a 1L resume, if you did not have legal experience, regardless of what you did, there's a way to make it valuable. So for example, and this of course will drop as you add legal experience. So let's say you worked at Starbucks. You don't have to describe making coffee. That's not useful. But did you have opening or closing responsibilities? Did you train other employees? Show if you were given any additional responsibilities that indicate your employer felt you were good at what you did, they trusted you. These are transferable characteristics that employers look for, and they can be very useful. So if you were in a sales position, sometimes that can be a really good experience that translates in terms of, talking to different audiences and working out your messaging when you approach people. That is a skill that's very valuable in the public interest sector. Okay. And yeah, so this experience would include internships or unpaid volunteer positions if you want. With public interest resumes, you may want to break out the unpaid stuff into a separate service section just to demonstrate, like, I wasn't getting paid and I still did this, so I'll come work for you, even if I'm not being paid. It's really up to you as to how you want to format that part of it, but when it comes to just a general resume, it all fits under experience. And I should also point out this too. You'll notice it doesn't have like hours per week worked or anything like that. That's very common on admissions resumes if you submitted one. It's also common with some government applications. But unless you're specifically asked to give that information, I just wouldn't bother. And okay, the descriptions. Again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying about like the Starbucks example. It's better if you're telling them about you through your descriptions. What kind of employee will you be? So not just what you did, but how you did it. Did you get any awards or some sort of recognition? If you worked in research, for example, or if you were a TA, did you get really good reviews from either faculty or from students that you tutored? Things that indicate your level of success are going to be more interesting to the employer than someone that just spouts off their duties. Okay, and so this is where it gets a little murky as far as like what you can do with this. So this has a personal section, which frankly is probably more applicable to the private sector. You can do a personal section for public interest, but I think they would find a service or leadership section perhaps a bit more valuable. But if you don't have those things, or if you feel like those things are better represented under education or experience, then a personal section is a good default. And basically, even with the personal section, you're telling them something about you. Sports, for example, team sports indicates an adeptness at collaboration. Chess shows a strategic mind. And I know this sounds like kind of a leap, but that's really sort of the deeper point behind these things. But at a basic level, it's a jumping off point for an interview. Because oftentimes that's how interviews will start, is with this more like warm and fuzzy part of your resume. With service, you can do it like the experience section and list out the organization, what your official title was, and the dates and a description, or you can just sort of list it out like the personal section with comments. Yes.
I have a quick question about experience. So, like, if you, I guess, like, interned during college, like every summer, and then I was a year out, so then I interned then. Like, how many experiences should you put? Like, I guess, like, your best for, like, every one you did. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would probably, and this goes for just general purposes, I would probably have a resume that has everything you've ever done, like a full CV, every little bit. And then from that, you can pull out what you feel is most important for the specific employer you're applying to. And that goes back to tailoring it to the recipient. So for starters, we don't want time gaps, but your undergrad fills that gap. So you don't have to include every summer in undergrad. You might pull out the ones that are relevant for the particular place you're applying to. But like that gap year between undergrad and law school, I would definitely have that represented. And, you know, I would start with the bigger volume and work with your counselor on what might be the most relevant thing. And it might be that you keep everything if they're all relevant and you just keep the descriptions very minimal so you can fit everything. And then you can talk more about them in the interview. Please, sure.
So I see that it's like chronological on here. Do you recommend it being chronological even if your last experience is like working at a water park when one below it may be more pertinent?
Yeah, that kind of depends. By and large, it should be reverse chronological order with most recent at the top. But I would say to answer your question, it depends. Depending on what other stuff you have, and if there's not a real-time gap, you might leave off the water park altogether. If, let's say, you have a good bit of like lobbying specific experience, and then you have a good bit of like research experience, you might have two sections where you've got like your like lobbying work up top and your research underneath it or something like that. So when you can break it out like that topically, I think it does make sense to separate. But again, that's why we work with our counselors because it's not like a hard and fast rule. Yes.
Like I'm coming straight through from college, for example. So like a lot of my resume is like college involvements and stuff like that. And how should we switch that coming into this? Like moving that to activities under undergrad, but also wanting to showcase like that's how I spent my time or leadership skills or whatnot.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think let's say you were super involved in student organizations, but you really didn't do internships, for example. You might make those organization involvements more of your experience section and leave them out of the education section. Yeah, that's probably how I would handle it if that's the case. If you've done it both, you were super involved and you had internships, I would probably leave them listed out briefly under your undergrad, but I would make a point of bringing it up in an interview to talk about how that involvement gave you skills or impacted your future plans, to kind of like highlight it more. And you can also talk about those things in a cover letter too. Any other questions at this point? Okay, this is great. Pre-COVID, I didn't have this kind of interaction. Okay, so cover letters. This is a huge pain point for people, but it shouldn't be. The thing is, it's very different. It's not an admissions essay, but it's also not a memo. It's kind of somewhere in between. They are looking, this is technically your first writing sample. So they want to see the proper headers. They want to see that it's, in a professional font and all that stuff. The other thing to keep in mind too is only submit one when they ask for it, because first, if they don't ask for it, you submit it, it looks like you weren't paying attention to their directions, but also there's a huge minefield of mistakes you can make, and you certainly don't want to give them a reason to not interview you. But if they do ask for one, you want to do a good one. So finding a contact name is really difficult with public interest. They're not going to have these lovely bios for all their staff on their website like the firms do. Hopefully they give you one for EJW. If they don't, I think I would do a LinkedIn search and look for the top guy or woman and put their contact in. And just that way you're not wrong necessarily, unless they've given you a contact and you ignore it. But I think it just seems much more personal. It looks like you took the care to look up somebody as opposed to just to whom it may concern. It should be short and sweet. When I say relevant, not redundant, I mean, you don't want to just regurgitate your resume in paragraph form. This should be the stuff that's in between the lines of your resume, the why of things. And to the extent you didn't already describe it in your job description, the like skills you gained or how well you did your job. that's, an opportunity here. And when I say not an autobiography, what I mean by that is this is more of like back to high school English, where you had the hamburger paragraph where it was like, this is what I'm telling you, and here's my support for it, and then here's a nice little bow to wrap it up. As opposed to when I was in college, I did this. And then after college, I did that. And then I decided to go to law school because it just doesn't read very well. It's not catchy. And when you're reading thousands of these things, you start to skim to the point of skipping. So this is what the roadmap for the cover letters. Again, lots of white space. You don't have to fill the page at all. But you want it to be very sort of clear and laid out, what they're getting if they interview you. So the introduction's really simple. It's, having your proper headers and the date and all that. Now, establishing qualifications. So your introduction should be immediately, first of all, who are you? And it doesn't start with my name is, because your name's at the bottom. You can figure that out. That's not the important thing. It's, I'm a first-year law student at Vanderbilt. Just to immediately let them know, okay, I'm dealing with a 1L. I am dealing with a law student. And what you're applying for. So I'm applying for an internship in your legal team or whatever. Because some of these groups have multiple different departments and you could be applying to a specific one. They could be hiring outside of legal. They could be hiring for software engineers or who knows what. And then basically, this is really important for public interest, why you want the job and what it is you're going to get out of it. Oh, let me back up. You can do this last bullet as a wholly entire separate second paragraph. And I certainly recommend that, especially if you have a personal connection to their work and their mission. Because again, like that's going to really make you stand out from applicants that are just, I want a job. And this sounds cool. Okay, body paragraph. I think this is really where people struggle. It really needs to be straightforward. Give me 2 to 3 reasons why I should hire you. What is it about you that makes you stand out from all the other 1Ls? Is it your writing skills? Is it the fact that you thrive in collaboration or you thrive in thinking on your feet? And then give me examples to demonstrate you have those 3 things. And it's not just you telling me you have them. I already went over. So basically you have your first sentence is your topic or assertion. And it's basically like, you should hire me because I have this, I am that, and I can be an asset to your team. And then the support would be, as a varsity soccer player for whatever undergrad, I worked extra hours with my team members to make sure that we were a cohesive unit or whatever the example is. And then the optional conclusion is, can you tie it back to what they do and how these skills and background that you have can, work for them. And if it makes, especially if it works really well with what they do. So let's say, for example, this is IUTA, and you work for a DA's office as like a victim's representative. That is a clear connection, but you still should make it for them in your conclusion. Be like, I would bring all of these skills and experience plus the legal knowledge I'm gaining to the work that IUTA does. So it's very kind of clear and straightforward. And these slides are going to be available in the document library, so you can look at them later, actually read the letter. Don't copy the letter. It's just not going to do you any good. So the conclusion is also very simple. It's the logistics of things. So be stating that you're interested in the job, thanking them for the consideration, how they can reach out to you. For EJW and programs like it, just simply saying, I hope to have the opportunity to meet with you at Equal Justice Works is sufficient. But otherwise it might be, please reach out to me if I can provide additional information. And then, yeah, which kind of goes in with that. And you can kind of write it as you see fit. It's just you want to kind of include these things. You might also include what are you sending them. So enclosed, I'm sending you my resume, writing sample, whatever they ask for. Okay, has everybody been in yes? Awesome. I don't have access to that, but I'm told this is what it looks like. And when they ask you for a transcript, even though you don't have grades, they might. So the way to do it is to ask for the sorted courses report, and it'll give you basically a course list with zeros instead of grades. So you can submit this because sometimes in these programs, they have so many documents to upload, and if you aren't uploading the right documents, your application won't go through. So this can take the place of that, and they should know you don't have grades yet, but if you want to add it into the conclusion of your cover letter, as soon as I receive grades, I will update you with my transcript. It's fine too. Okay, so we have come to the end. You should know about this. If you don't, it'll be in the slide deck. So you can work with your counselor both on just reviewing these documents, talking about your strategy for which organizations to apply for, what have you. But I think it's especially helpful to meet with us before you have an interview, especially because this program is so early. And your counselor can go through some questions with you that you can expect to be asked, and kind of like, it's sort of like a casual role play, but we can help you if like something just doesn't ring true, or something just needs to be like better fleshed out or edited in my case. And then, you'll hear more from the public interest office about the logistics. The other thing I want to mention is EJW, they've now bifurcated it. So the conference is separate from the career fair, but you have access to both. And the conference can be really useful because a lot of times they have sessions on pathways to particular things. Like if you want to do international human rights, for example, they might have a session on it and figuring out, okay, what kind of internships would be useful? What does the post-grad job search look like? They might have a whole section on fellowships, which that's more of a 2L thing, but it's never too early to start looking at those because they're very competitive and they have a very rigorous application process, especially if you're doing what's called a project fellowship where you design what it is you're doing. And I feel like I'm getting way ahead here, but it's good to go to the conference. So take advantage of those. Table talk is wonderful. So when it was in person, they would reserve a few hours of the day where anybody could walk up to an employer and chat them up. And that's very useful for if you didn't get an interview with somebody or if they're not interviewing one else. So now that's all virtual, but you really need to take advantage of it. Just because you don't have a scheduled interview does not mean you can't get a job through Table Talk. And a lot of people either just think there's no payoff or they're just scared to do it. But again, you can work with your counselor to sort of like role play how that conversation might go and what you might say to them. Usually it's just asking them open-ended questions about what they do and their experiences. Although you should know something about the organization, like you don't just walk up and go, so what does legal aid do? Because they're gonna look at you like, really? We have a website. But we can work with you to figure out what questions to ask. So, as I mentioned, the Public Interest Office has their resources on the Student Resources page in the website. Does everybody know what this is, where it is? I'm seeing heads nodding. If you don't, come talk to me, I'll show you. So they have a lot of like different guides to like, what is it to be a prosecutor, public defender? And what's the difference between direct legal representation and public advocacy? We also have psjd.org, which your counselor should talk to you about as well. It's a huge public interest job board, and they have a bunch of guides on interviewing and financial resources and all kinds of good stuff. You have to make a student account, but your Vandy email should be recognized, and then you just create a password and go. Coming up, we'll have Government and Public Interest Day. It's a career fair, more of a table talk pure table talk kind of event that'll be in the law school, and there will be, it's mostly local, but we do get them from out of state too, where you can just walk around and chat them up and hand them your resume and you might get a job out of it. And then recruitment handbooks. I know we talked to you all about this briefly at orientation. It's a great way to just sort of run a search. If you're looking for, I don't know, public interest in Chicago, you can just run a Chicago search through those books and see what 2Ls and 3Ls might have done that might have been public interest in Chicago, and then go talk to them. And sometimes that can be what you need to get an interview, because these organizations stay in touch with their interns usually. And if the intern calls them up and says, oh, I met a 1L, that's great, and they're really interested and something else about you, they might just be like, wonderful, give me their information. And then they might reach out to you and give you an interview. So that kind of networking can't be undervalued. And then we begin September 14th, right? Yes, with the kickoff. So please do plan to come to that. If you are pure public interest, you have no interest at all in the private sector, you know, not every program is going to be necessarily relevant to you, but a lot of them will. Like even our litigation panel will have at least one plaintiff's attorney, and plaintiff's attorneys kind of straddle that line of private and public sector. Some of them are true nonprofit law firms and some are not, but the clientele they represent and the cases they represent are very closely aligned to public interest. So again, check with your counselor before you just assume and skip out on a program that might be really useful to you. And other than that, I think we're towards the end. Any questions? Yes.
So I know at the beginning you said like this is really early on in like recruiting. What is like the normal public interest timeline, especially relative to like private firms?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And it's a little fuzzy just because these guys are not in step with each other like firms often are. But I would say majority of public sector job offering happens in February and March. Now, some is going to be earlier, particularly if it's a really like popular big program like Sierra Club. But, and then there are going to be some that are far later. Like there's a group in New York called Earth Justice. If anyone's heard of them? I've had them give offers as late as May. So it's really kind of an ongoing cycle, and you have to be diligent until you find that offer that you feel good about accepting. And that's the tricky part in all this. You could get a job from EJW and be done by November, which I'm sure sounds wonderful to a lot of people, but it might be longer. And some of that depends on how open you are, what particularly you're interested in and whatnot. But you work with your counselor to kind of work out a way to stay on track and do this as efficiently as possible.
If you get a job through EJW and you're still like you want to feel out your other options, what's the timeline that's appropriate from offer to acceptance or denial?
That's great. It depends on the employer, but most public interest organizations are very flexible. So what I would do is if you got an offer, first you acknowledge it and say, this is so exciting. I really appreciate this opportunity. When do you need a response? And kind of put it back on them. And most of the time, they're going to write back and be like, whenever. I mean, seriously, the firms do not do that. But a lot of the public interest organizations will do that. And sometimes if they come back and they're like, well, we'd like to know in like 2 weeks or something, and you know something in particular, like DOJ doesn't even open up until December 1st, you can go back to them and say, there's another opportunity that I wanted to pursue, and perhaps I could even do both. Is it possible if I give you an answer more like in January? And, you know, they can come back and be like, sure, no problem. Or they can come back and be like, no. And then you just have to make a decision. But like I said, majority of these guys are going to be super accommodating. Yes.
Can I take us back to the resume for a second?
Yeah.
What about like other sections that weren't listed here? So I'm thinking like a publication section. You said the thesis was good, but if you have other writing.
Yeah, so thesis should go under education as like, you know, one line basically being like thesis colon and then your title. And if it was published, the publication information. If you have multiple things, meaning like more than two, then yeah, I would probably have a second section that's publications, and it should go under experience, but ahead of like interest. And depending on what you've got, perhaps below service or perhaps before it. And you know, that can include speaking engagements. It doesn't have to just be written stuff. It's just your header will depend on whether it's all one or if it's a combination of things. Yes.
So when you were talking about the funding, so at the very beginning, you said that we should mention that Vandy gives us stipends. So is that something we mentioned in our like cover letters? Because you said you know, to get interviewed.
Yes, so your introduction, it would sort of be the whole, I'm a first year law student at Vanderbilt, I'm applying for this program, I'm interested in this program because of X. I have family in the DC area and will have housing available. I also intend to apply for stipend funding through Vanderbilt. And that's all you have to say. But it's enough that lets them know, okay, she's not gonna bail on us just because she didn't have a way to pay her bills for the summer, or she doesn't want to take out loans for the summer. Any other questions? You guys have been wonderful. Thank you so much for your attention and your participation. You can reach out to me. It's elizabeth.b.key@Vanderbilt. Or of course, you can go ahead and reach out to your counselor since you know who it is at this point. You know, let us know how we can help you. And good luck with your applications.
Thank you.